The Vikings were brutal. It was the early Middle Ages. Everyone was brutal. The most powerful Christian king at the start of the Viking era was Charlemagne. Charlemagne may have been Christian and well-educated, but that didn't stop him from waging a genocidal war against the Saxons of Germany in his campaign to convert them to Christianity. Saxon children were instructed to report any pagan activity. Many pagan men and women were burned alive, and many Saxon children were taken back to Charlemagne's kingdom and raised as Christians. Pretty brutal, right? The Magyars of today's Hungary became Christian around 1000 under King, now Saint, Stephen. Stephen was brutal too. He burned stubborn pagans at the stake, among other punishments. The only real reason the Vikings were considered especially brutal, and they were, make no mistake, was that combined with their brutality was their habit of appearing suddenly out of nowhere and killing many unsuspecting people. Then, they took the survivors as slaves and then disappeared. They did this for about 300 years before most converted to Christianity. At that point, Scandinavian raids essentially stopped, and the tales of their brutality stopped as well. But before we tell you all about that, I want to take a minute to give a shout out to something that is both this video's sponsor and one of my favorite games right now, the incredible game World of Warships. This game features the same epic combination of grisly warfare and the endless ocean exploration that made me love Viking history. It's a free-to-play PC game that I've been hooked on because it gives you the chance to command a warship and build your own navy. It's perfect for history lovers because the game genuinely makes you feel like a time traveler due to its top-notch graphics, with dynamic weather and water textures, and amazing details like getting to choose between multiple ships and even getting to dive with submarines. The thing about naval history is that it's almost endless, just like the ocean itself, and World of Warships captures this by always giving me new things to explore. It has 40 different maps and releases new content every month, like new ships and in-game nations. I'm hooked! World of Warships is available on the PC and consoles, and it even gives you the chance to play as a lone wolf or form a division with your friends. So download World of Warships from the link in the description. And, even better, I have a promo code that'll give you a huge free starter pack with 500 doubloons, 1.5 million credits, and 7 days of premium account time. You'll even get the free choice of one premium ship after you complete 15 battles: USS Phoenix, Japanese cruiser Kuma, French battleship Courbet, Italian battleship Dante Alighieri, or my favorite, the HMS Wakeful. So take charge of the seas, like warriors from Vikings to veterans did, and download the game today. In February 2022, Netflix premiered the sequel to History Channel's Vikings, called Vikings Valhalla. Two main characters are the famous Leif Eriksson and his sister, Freydis Eriksdotter. As you may know, Leif is reputed to have arrived in North America centuries before Christopher Columbus. Some accounts in the Norse sagas include a couple of tales of Leif's sister, Freydis. But in one of them, the close brother-sister relationship depicted in the series is anything but that. We'll tell you about that in a moment. It seems that Freydis wanted her father Erik's house in North America for her own. Erik tells her she can use his home in Vinland, the Norse name for North America, but not take it as hers. Wow! He likely was never going back and hadn't been there for years. Maybe Erik was greedy. Maybe Freydis was a bitch. Maybe both. In one of the depictions of Freydis, she is depicted as a brave warrior. Both of the tales have to do with her landing in Vinland. As a heroine, and a particularly Viking heroine, Freydis watches as the men of her party battle with Native Americans. The battle goes poorly for the outnumbered Vikings, and they begin to run away. Seeing this, Freydis, very pregnant, grabs a sword and runs toward the natives while tearing open her blouse. Standing in front of them, she beats her naked breast with a sword and yells a battle cry. Completely shaken by this unusual act, the Native Americans turn and run. Shortly thereafter, the Vikings of Vinland decided that going back to Greenland and Iceland is the better part of valor. and leave, never to return. Incidentally, the Viking name for the natives was Skraelings or Screechers, no doubt for their high-pitched war whoops. That's the not-so-brutal, but the other tale of Freydis is, and it does not put her in a good light. Having landed in North America some years after Erik, Freydis and two brothers, Helgi and Finnbogi, go to the home built by Erik some years before. After some time in the New World, Freydis and the two brothers begin to get on each other's nerves. Aggravating someone in Viking times was risky, even if that someone was a woman, especially if it was Freydis. After an argument about divvying up goods, Freydis returns to her home and the crew that manned her boat. She tells her husband, Thorvard, that the brothers ripped her off and that one of them hit her. She then kept telling Thorvard that her honor and his demanded revenge, and that he should be a man and get it. Being Vikings, that's precisely what happened. In a Viking-era commando raid, Thorvard and his men sneak into the brothers' camp, capture them, tie them up, then kill them. Not being complete savages, they leave the 5 women in the brothers' party alive, but apparently Freydis had a problem with that and told her husband to kill them too. When he and his men refuse, Freydis grabs an axe and hacks the women to pieces. A far cry from the Freydis on Vikings Valhalla. Shortly after the massacre, Freydis and her men return to Iceland. She has the men swear to her that they will not tell a soul about the massacre in Vinland, but someone spills the beans. When her brother Leif finds out what happened, he places a curse on her, her unborn child, and any children to come. Not an example of brotherly love, that's for sure. Icelandic is the language most closely related to the Old Norse of the Vikings. The Vikings were essentially illiterate people, and the alphabet they did have, comprised of runes, was not truly made for writing. It was simple and direct. However, the people of Iceland today are perhaps the most literate people on Earth. There are many reasons for that, but Icelandic literacy started because of the Viking naming system Icelanders still use. As you just heard, Leif and Freydis were the children of Erik the Red, Eriksdotter and Eriksson, Erik's daughter and Erik's son. With a naming system like that, it's vital to record detailed family trees to avoid too closely inbreeding. Many Icelanders today possess family trees going back hundreds and hundreds of years. Of course, now many take DNA tests rather than rely on old parchments, but the naming system of the Vikings lives on. By the way, Erik's real name was Erik Thorvaldsson. Speaking of Erik the Red, he was no stranger to brutality. He ordered his slaves to cause a landslide, destroying the farm of a rival named Voltjof. In retaliation, Voltjof's friend, Eyjolf, killed Erik's slaves. Slaves cost money. Erik then hunted down Eyjolf and one of his relatives and killed them. So, naturally, Eyjolf's family wanted revenge, and they got it. Erik was outlawed and exiled for 3 years. Before he left for his exile on a small island off the Icelandic coast, Erik asked his friend Thorgest to watch his home, especially the spiritually meaningful Sitstokker, engraved pillars. While he was there, Erik built a new house on the Viking version of Survivor's Exile Island. After he finished building, Erik asked for his Setstokker back, and Thorgest refused. There are conflicting accounts of this, and the pillars that Erik took may have been his friends. Either way, Erik took off with the pillars, and Thorgest and several of his men took off after him. Apparently, Erik was as much a badass as Vikings Valhalla relates, for he killed 2 of Thorgest's sons and a few of his other men. This feud led to a thing, the famous Viking meetings to decide raids and make judgments. In the end, Erik was outlawed for another 3 years, despite many other warriors' support. Vikings took slaves, lots of them, from Ireland to the coasts of the Black Sea. They sold many of these people, and at times bought others. Sadly, the market for enslaved people was much like the market for anything else. What is in demand sells. Though Danish, Norwegian, Swedish, and Icelandic Vikings needed slaves at home, many of the Vikings' biggest and wealthiest customers were in the Eastern Roman Empire, with its capital at Constantinople, today's Istanbul. Though healthy men were always needed for hard labor, some of the most prized and expensive slaves were monks, brought from monasteries in the areas raided by the Northmen. Comparatively speaking, monks were educated and worldly, in the sense that they knew more about the world, at least from books, than almost anyone else. At the time of the Viking raids, Catholic monks and priests were not sworn to chastity, though some monks took that vow. To ensure that when they became the tutors of young children and women in the empire, they did not molest or impregnate their charges, many of them were castrated. Eunuchs, men without testicles, not men without penises as you might read on some ill-informed websites, were prized not only as educators and babysitters to the rich and powerful, but were often seen as men who were more focused, or rather less distracted, than intact males, and were often trusted with positions of influence and power. Unfortunately, to get those positions of power and influence, they endured an amazingly painful process. Aside from the obvious, wounds were most often not sutured. This could, and did, lead to fatal infections in the time before a complete understanding of antiseptic practices. No, the wounds were cauterized, seared with hot iron. By the way, physical castration does not necessarily mean a man can't have sex. Hormones sometimes still build up in the body, and the mechanics of sex are not disturbed. So, no pregnancy, but who knows what some of those slaves were really doing with the king's wife. Sadly, it does not take too much imagination to figure out what could, and often did, happen to the female slaves, young and old. We're not going to describe it to you, but sadly, this was not the only thing that women and girls faced if they were taken as slaves. Of course, beatings for both male and female slaves was common. However, in the case of women who defied their male or female Viking masters, a special punishment was sometimes inflicted: the loss of the hands and feet. Even if a person should survive that ordeal, they were left absolutely helpless and soon died from thirst or starvation shortly thereafter. One of the episodes of the original Vikings series has the hero, or is it anti-hero, Ragnar, arguing with his wife. The subject of the argument was whether or not they should take their newborn and severely disabled son, Ivar, out to the forest in winter to die from exposure. As you may know, Ragnar struggles with the act, and his wife, Aslaug, retrieves the baby before anything bad can happen. Vikings were not the only people to kill their disabled infants. Neither were they the only culture in history to practice female infanticide, which continued on a large scale in some countries well into the 20th century. Female infanticide did not happen simply because Viking men preferred sons over daughters, though that likely occurred. No, daughters, especially among the rich and powerful, had a value. They could be married off for a handsome dowry, cement alliances between clans, or help establish peace through intermarriage. However, among those who were not rich and powerful, female infanticide could occur for several reasons. If a family was living on the edge of hunger, and many people were, almost all the time, they might, already having children to feed, might kill their daughter at birth. When it came down to numbers in the world of the Vikings, and many other warrior cultures around the globe, sons were more valuable. They could very simply add to the family line when better times came. In times of war, a son was more valuable as he could take up arms. Despite recent discoveries of women warriors, the chances of a woman becoming a soldier or military leader were slim in the extreme. Women were viewed as physically weak, and when push came to shove, were disposable. Ever wonder why you never see nearsighted Vikings? The Vikings' diet was so poor that it's likely that many suffered from poor eyesight, even if they didn't develop it while young, as most do. No, in virtually all shows about Vikings and the medieval world at large, and the ancient world too, as a matter of fact, people are either eagle-eyed or completely blind. No nearsighted people at all. That can't be. Though we are not aware of any historical study on the topic, it seems likely that if Viking men were nearsighted, they would not be archers, that's for sure. No, they would likely be in the famous shield wall in every battle. If you saw a 40-year-old nearsighted Viking, he'd likely be tough as nails and a very good fighter. In the shield wall, you don't have to see far. Your enemy is right in front of your face, literally. Know who else might be right in front of your face in a fight? Some other Viking who just insulted you or your family. Maybe the two of you were both drinking, and what Viking wasn't, and decided that you just didn't like each other. Holmgang time. The holmgang was like the duel of later centuries, except it was fought with swords, axes, knives, spears, Viking stuff. Seriously though, most of the time, a holmgang was not the Viking version of a bar fight. Those happened enough. No, many times the holmgang was a challenge that was formalized and happened at a certain time and place. Maybe an insult had been delivered. It would do no good for a bunch of Vikings on a raid, or planning one, to go berserk and start killing each other in a drunken brawl. Far better that the two men concerned met in a prearranged place, along with their seconds, usually a friend or family member. A small square or circle was drawn in the dirt or marked with boundaries, and the men had it out in it. Voluntarily moving out of the square or circle was considered cowardly and might even cause one's second to abandon you. Incapacitation due to wounds most often led to one being killed. The holmgang was a fight to the death. Sometimes today you will hear men, and sometimes women, say something like, "I wish I could have lived in Viking times." No, you don't. If you liked this video, please tell your friends and kinsmen about us. Like, subscribe, and skål to you.